This is Dan Schneider, and this is American Television with Mitchell Hadley. This show we will be talking about police and detective shows. And Mitch, let's get a little bit about your background for people who don't know you, and then we'll hit the ground running.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. For people who have not been familiar with some of my work, I write at the website itsabouttv.com. I'm a classic era TV historian and cultural critic. I've written 3 books, including The Electronic Mirror, which looks at how classic television tells us who we were and who we are. And my new book will be coming out in August. It's called Darkness in Prime Time, and it looks at how classic era television shows foresaw today modern society's descent into hell.
So, the topic is police and detective shows, and for me, I've always sort of separated those two because the detective shows generally are about private detectives like Thomas Magnum or a Jim Rockford and later iterations, and I guess even some early iterations, whereas police shows, even if they're not technically police like the FBI or whatnot, they tend to be different in the sense that the police shows oftentimes are procedurals, whereas the detective shows are really classical. This is the hero going up against the corrupt villain or whatever it might be.
Yes.
So what do you see as the linkage between those two seemingly separate domains?
Well, I think if you want to, you can go back even a little bit farther to the golden age of the Western, because you can draw a link that goes through all 3 of these. You have the Western as the prototypical American morality play, where you've got the good guy in the white hat, the bad guy in the black hat. Now, the police procedural started on TV about the same time as the Westerns. They both had their roots in radio, and they both were big parts of early television. But as America became more urban, and as the concerns that Americans had became more associated with what you would have in the contemporary urban environment, you saw kind of a transition from the Western to the police drama. They were still dealing with essentially the same kinds of subjects, but instead of Wyatt Earp, you had Joe Friday. Now, where the detective series starts to share ground with this, I think, is that the private detective was not encumbered by the same things that a police lieutenant might be shackled with. He didn't have to follow the letter of the law. And you can see that in any number of shows, but I'll just throw out Mike Hammer as an example, where you have the police acknowledging that Hammer has a certain latitude that they don't have. He can beat the truth out of a suspect. The cops can't do that, or at least they're not supposed to do that, and they don't do it in the early TV shows. But you understand that the private cop can go outside of the latitude of the law. And as you get into an era where there seem to be more and more restraints on what the police can and can't do, whether you're talking about the Miranda era or the Civil Rights era or anything like that, you see this appeal that a private eye has, that he can do things the cops can't. And so even though all 3 of these genres, the Western, the police show, and the private detective, even though they're all concerned with good and evil, the law and breaking the law, they approach it from 3 different areas. And I think that's where they converge, but it's also where they separate into their own distinct genres.
So if we start with radio, we're probably going back to the 30s or the 40s, because I think wasn't The Shadow, wasn't he a detective of some sort, a private eye? So what was he the first, or who preceded The Shadow?
He was one of the first that I think you had. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. You had some others that were middling success. You had the Falcon, which was sort of like an American version of the Saint. A lot of these were where you had people who were not professional detectives in the sense that, say, Sherlock Holmes or an Hercule Poirot would be, but they kind of did, murder as my hobby. That was one of the titles of one of them, and you had shows like Man Against Crime, Police Precinct, different programs like that were not what I would call necessarily the adult police procedural that we got used to. We had magicians solving crimes, mystery writers solving crimes, everything that falls into the category of the amateur detective. And you combine that with policemen who generally were able to solve a murder in about 22 minutes. And I know we're talking about the running time there, but we're also talking about not really seeing what goes into detective work. And that's where I think, the first great police show on the radio comes in, and that's Dragnet. And Dragnet was well established on radio before it went to television. Then they ran concurrently for a while before it went completely into television. But I think what's important about Dragnet is that you see really what police work is about. You see them walking the pavement, going through files, interviewing people who wind up having nothing to do with the case whatsoever. Whereas a show like Broadway is My Beat, for an example of a radio drama, they always seem to know exactly who to talk to. And while in Dragnet, for time purposes, you usually heard Friday and Smith talking with the right people, but not before Joe Friday's narration tells you a little bit about how it took them a week to get to that point of view. So, in the same way that we talk about Wyatt Earp and Maverick being two of the first adult westerns, I think you can look at a show like Dragnet as being the first adult police procedural. And there was another very popular radio show called Gangbusters that was on at the same time as Dragnet, one of the most popular radio police shows. But that was a little different. That was an anthology, so you didn't have a regular cast, you didn't have a regular setting. The reason I bring that up, though, aside from its popularity on the radio, is that when Dragnet went to television in 1951, Gangbusters came along with it. And for the first half of the season that they were on, they alternated every other week in the same time slot. And they were both in the top 10 in ratings. I think Gangbusters, if I'm remembering correctly, Gangbusters was actually rated 8th in the equivalent of the Nielsen's at the time. But that only ran for 3/4 of a season, maybe. And the reason that was given was that it was never intended to be a weekly series. Because Jack Webb hadn't been sure about how long it was going to take to do Dragnet, and he was doing both for radio and television. He wasn't confident that he'd be able to do a new Dragnet show every week. So they brought Gangbusters along to alternate, to allow Webb to develop Dragnet as a weekly concept. Once Dragnet's popularity confirmed that it was able to go as a weekly show, then Gangbusters goes off the air. But I think with Dragnet, you see the establishment of the proto-formula for how a police procedural in the 50s is going to operate.
Yeah, Dragnet basically had the only recurring characters were Smith and Friday, and basically the rest of the show was about the accused or the victim or whatnot. And that brings me to a show that didn't come from radio, but did come from film, and that was Jules Dassin's Naked City, which became also a kind of police procedural. But as I recall, and I was very young watching some of the early black and whites, the difference, it seemed to me, even back then, was a Naked City did focus more on the human aspect of the people involved in what crime, whereas Dragnet was more of a just the facts man.
Yeah, Dragnet spawned a number of similar shows, which I'll just briefly touch on here. M Squad, which was Lee Marvin's only dramatic television weekly series. M Squad is Dragnet in Chicago. You had another series called The Lineup, which is Dragnet in San Francisco. And in all three of these shows, the city was an actor, if you will, in the series. Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles all played very important parts in the story themselves, but they were all very similar, the emphasis on the procedure. Now, when you come up to Naked City, and I'm a great admirer of Naked City, the TV series, I believe that is not only one of the best police shows in TV history, I think it's one of the finest dramas, period. In its first incarnation, Naked City followed the movie very closely. The characters all came over from the movie, the main characters. The title even came over from the movie. It was called The Naked City. And the whole narrative theme about there are 8 million stories in the Naked City, this is one of them. That was what really established New York as the lead character. Yeah. Now, as Naked City evolved, it took a very interesting direction. It had started out, as I say, the first season was a half an hour drama, and it was a fairly conventional police drama, although you did get to know the policeman fairly well. You had James Franciscus, who was playing the young detective, and you got to see a little bit of his home life, and you got to understand a little bit about how the pressures of his home life affected his job and vice versa. That only lasted a season, and it went off the air. But a year later, they resuscitated Naked City as an hour-long drama, and they brought over the same characters again. They had actually, to back up, they had killed off the main character, John Ireland, in the half-hour version. They had killed him off because he wanted to get off of the rigors of a weekly series, and they'd replaced him with Horace McMahon as the head of the squad. And so when it comes back as an hour-long show, it has added 30 minutes. It's dropped "the" from the title. Now it's just Naked City. And in place of James Franciscus, you have Paul Burke, who is in essence playing the same kind of character. Not the same name, but the same kind of character. But you see a degree of development in his private life that is beyond what we are used to seeing in police series to this point. He's got a regular girlfriend, Libby. She's an actress wannabe, so she is trying to make it big. You get to follow her struggles to get on the stage. You get to see the relationship between the two of them, who are obviously going to get married, but it's a situation where you get to appreciate just what it is that a policeman goes through. He can't afford to get married and have a wife and kids right now. So there's kind of an understanding that they're waiting on marriage until he is more financially secure, and perhaps until Libby is able to succeed in acting. And so you've got this whole backstory for them that becomes a crucial element of the show, because it shows how his character, Adam Flint, is a fully rounded human being. And then the other aspect that I think makes Naked City so interesting is, as you pointed out, there's a real emphasis on the other people, the guest stars, whether you're talking about them as the victims or the perpetrators. You really get to know them. You get to see something about their situation in life, their background, what kind of influence the environment has had on them. They're not all murder stories. Some of them are robberies. Some of them are domestic dramas. You see all of these different aspects. You have some terrific actors playing these. Robert Duvall, for instance, who adds something to every show that he's in. Duvall's in, I think, a number of Naked City episodes, and a lot of other actors are too. And it starts to represent, in a way, what Gunsmoke was in its last few years. It's almost like an anthology where the detectives themselves are in the background in many of these stories. And the crime that they're investigating, or the crime that has been committed, is really only kind of a loose entree into what the story is about, which is not about the crime at all. It's about the people involved. So one of the things that I like to say about Naked City, it's kind of a comparison that I make. The Naked City is not a show about policemen. It's a show about men who happen to work for the police department. And that makes a big difference. And it's a literate show, it's a fascinating show, and it presents a group of individuals in terms of the detectives that you like, that you respect, that are very professional in their work, and that have a great regard and rapport with each other. So you get to see their interactions as a team as well as their interactions in investigating the cases. And I think that makes for a very interesting dynamic as to why that series works so well. It was only on for 4 years in total, and one of those seasons is the half-hour dramas. But if there's one police series I could point to where I'd really like to have seen more of that, it was Naked City, because that was just an outstanding drama, period, regardless of its genre.
Poor James Franciscus, they killed him off, and then they supposedly found him. He became an astronaut and went off after Charlton Heston. And,
and then he got blinded and became a private detective.
So you mentioned we started off talking about the police procedurals here, but let's go back to the detective side. At the same time, in early television, the late 40s, the late 50s, I know that they did a few live television shows with characters like Sam Spade from Dash Hammett, and or was Sam Spade Dash Hammett? I forget, but and so they had these classical characters that had already been established from in the Warner Brothers films and in film noir, and they brought them over to the live television shows. But what was the first purely detective fiction, not just a guest starring Sam Spade, the famous detective, or Hercule Poirot, or Miss Marple, whatever? What was the first purely television detective show?
I'm trying to think. I'm not entirely sure what the first one to come along was that was clearly made for television and didn't have its roots either in the radio or with the classic fiction, because as you pointed out, you've got Sam Spade, you've got Philip Marlowe, you have the Shadow, you have the Falcon, you have all of these characters who do have their roots in fiction. And all of them made a transition, or most of them at least made a transition to television. I think the one that didn't was yours truly, Johnny Dollar, which was really one of the last great detective, or one of the last great weekly radio series, period. It went off the air in 1962, and I think arguably it was the last, along with Suspense, the last weekly radio drama on the radio, but it never made a transition to TV either. So if you're you've got Boston Blackie as another example, and that was not only a spin-off of the radio series, but it was a spin-off of a successful series of movies that Chester Morris was in. So you had Richard Diamond, again, transition from radio to television. I would be tempted to say whether it's the first or not. I think one of the first successful, popular, original detective shows to make it onto TV was 77 Sunset Strip, and that was a Warner Brothers drama. Had a rotating cast. Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., was the best known and the only one who stayed with the cast for the entire, or with the show for the entire time. But 77 Sunset Strip spawned a number of similar shows from Warner Brothers. I had Surfside 6, Bourbon Street Beat, um, the Roaring Twenties. All these shows that had this rhythmic title, that had um, that had rotating characters, that really presented detectives as living a glamorous life. They were called the Jazz Detectives. You had Johnny Staccato, which was John Cassavetes. You had Peter Gunn, which was Craig Stevens, and you had a brief run of no, what was it? Um, the name escapes me right now. He's the private detective that was located in Miami. It was played by Richard Denning. But you had these private detective shows that were starting to develop for TV that had a very specific way in which they played the detective. You mentioned the traditional kind, the Sam Spades, the Marlowes, the tough, hard-boiled, noirish private detective who always wore the fedora. Mike Hammer, for instance, who always wore the fedora, always had a glamorous dame on his arm, and but was always talking about the classic line. I had 7 shots in me. One was a bullet, the other 6 were scotch. That kind of line, but the Warner Brothers mysteries, the Jazz Detectives, they started to portray detectives in a different way. You had them wearing expensive suits, pocket hankies. They didn't necessarily have an office. Peter Gunn worked out of Mother's, which was a bar, a restaurant bar. But on the other hand, you had Sunset Strip, where they actually had an office. They had a receptionist who sometimes took part in their escapades. You had a car park attendant, Ed Burns, who became very popular on his own. So it was kind of a sanitized version of the private detective. Even when they made Philip Marlowe as a detective on TV, he was cleaned up a bit from what he was in the books. They weren't as introspective. And actually, that's one thing I want to mention, is a big difference between the detective fiction that we see in radio and on television, and that which we saw as its genesis in literature, was that for as many pulp novels as you have about detective fiction, there's kind of an existential aspect to them that gets overlooked when they come to TV. Whether you're talking about, particularly in the case of someone like Marlowe, who is pondering in many of his cases really what the meaning of them is. What's the meaning of life? What is the futility of this crime? What do the lives of the people who are involved in these cases really mean? And you get that in the movies, and in much more so even in the books. You don't get that so much in TV, where the emphasis is on action. But that's kind of your development of the detective series, with this emphasis on action, on violence, on independence. And again, that was something I had mentioned earlier, the independence of the lone wolf detective. There's another example, by the way, the lone wolf, played by Lewis Calhern, who is again a spin-off from radio and from a series of books. But the lone wolf detective really has only himself and maybe his secretary to depend on. So it's one man against crime. And it may or may not be popular, but it's a very compelling form of storytelling.
So the mid '60s, we've talked about this before. We had a lot of legal shows coming up. Perry Mason, The Defenders, being two of the better ones. There seemed to always be sort of a bit of a crossover, or a melding, because a lot of these legal shows, uh, the they weren't realistic, in the sense that sometimes you would have a Perry Mason have people who would be doing detective work for him. So,
Hmm.
were they really detective shows? Were they strictly legal shows? Where do you put what bucket do you put a show like Perry Mason in?
Well, it's interesting that when you look at the old TV guides from when the show was in its first run up until the mid 60s, it was always classified as a mystery. It was
Mm.
never a crime drama or even a drama. It was always called a mystery. And I think that's because of the element of the lawyer solving crime as well as defending his client. The last half hour of any Perry Mason episode is superb once you get him into the courtroom and you have the courtroom setting that everybody knows and loves. But the rest of the time, Mason is out there doing almost as much work as Paul Drake is, and quite frankly, in many cases, even more effectively than Drake is. So, I think Perry Mason is a hybrid. It's not a pure detective series because you didn't see the end result in most of these other detective series. You didn't see the trial. What you usually wind up seeing is the sidekick of the detective, his police contact, looking at a chalk outline of the body of the perp that the detective has just blown away. So that was how they got resolution in a lot of these cases. Perry Mason is unique in that sense. So I would consider that a hybrid. Really, it was neither fish nor fowl, or maybe it was both fish and fowl.
How about a show like the FBI? Is that, I mean, technically it's not a cop drama because FBI agents have different powers and
Yeah.
a different purview than, say, Joe Friday in L.A. with the LAPD. Is that also something you'd consider a hybrid?
Sort of, because of what you mentioned, that you're looking at a different aspect of police work. We know that the FBI, in its broadest sense, FBI agents are law enforcement officials, which I guess is what you call policemen nowadays, or police officials. But they have a different. They not only have different powers, they have different emphasis. At least when I was growing up and reading about the FBI, because any kid who grew up watching the FBI wanted to join the FBI, and so I had some reading material about the FBI, and you either had to have a law degree or an accounting degree. Be a CPA to join the FBI because of its emphasis on financial crimes as well as other kinds of crime. The FBI, for instance, was giving a version of the Miranda warning long before local police departments did. That was just part of their routine, that they would warn suspects that whatever they said could be used against them. And so they were a different kind of law enforcement official. And you're right, they do have different kinds of crimes that they're looking at that aren't really sexy enough to show in most police procedurals. You're not going to get a lot of mileage out of most kinds of embezzlement shows unless it's something like The Untouchables, where embezzlement is a part of the whole financial aspect of it is a part of Crime Incorporated and the syndicate. But the FBI, I think I would put more in a category with a show like Naked City, where you had these extremely strong leads, especially Ephraim Zimbalist, the honorary FBI official who became a close personal friend of J. Edgar Hoover, actually sat in the family section at Hoover's state funeral. So you had these strong regulars, but a lot of times the emphasis and the storytelling was around the men and women who were wanted by the FBI. Most of these people were not simple criminals, and they were well-rounded characters where you got to know their motivations, you got to know how they wound up there, you got to actually thrill a bit to the chase between them and the FBI, never to the point where you were rooting for them to escape from Louis Erskine, but that you got caught up in the chase itself because you did have a certain amount of emotional investment in the criminals themselves. So I put that in the Naked City category of being a quasi anthology where you really are stressing the guest stars and the stories of their characters, and it rises to that level in a literate as well as a storytelling aspect.
The Untouchables is similar to the FBI because it was with the FBI, although it was
Hmm.
historically set a few decades earlier, whereas the FBI was a then modern date, a current show. But the Untouchables also dealt with the what Elliot Ness would do with famous cases. They'd sometimes rehash, although
Hmm.
change the details, going after famous mobsters. So there was a different focus. Those two shows. What which one do you think evoked the FBI or the genre better? Do you think?
Well, I think that the Untouchables is more of what you would expect from a police slash detective kind of story, in that there was a lot of action, there was a lot of violence. The criminals were very colorful. They were not as well rounded as you'd see in a show like the FBI, but they weren't cardboard characters either. Frank Nitti has got to be one of the great secondary characters in the history of television. The way that Gordon plays him on there, they always give him, in any episode where Bruce Gordon is playing Nitti, they always give him the best lines, better even than Robert Stack's. And so um, I think in that sense, the tropes are much more closely aligned to a traditional show. It's not as subtle for the most part. Although I was thinking about this last month. I had run a piece on the uh, the website about the anniversary of Elizabeth Montgomery's passing, and um, she was in an early episode of The Untouchables that really gave us quite a bit more depth to Elliot Ness's character than we're accustomed to seeing, and which we don't really see again to that extent. And so that's another reason why I would say that The Untouchables is a very close focus on the more traditional type of storytelling, and that we don't know anything about Ness. It's been established he has a wife and a family. They never do anything with that. You never see where he lives. You never see what he does. He doesn't have any hobbies. He doesn't go on vacation. He's work all the time, and that is like the FBI, in the sense that I think only once or twice do we ever see the apartment that Lou Erskine lives in. It's not about their personal lives at all, but I think that The Untouchables has more of the um, action-oriented aspect to it that you would expect from a police series, and less of the thoughtful character development.
Um, So I did want to talk about three series that at the end of the '60s I think really changed the cop drama. Um, but I did want to also ask though, Frank Nitti, the historical actual Frank Nitti,
Hmm.
is the direct source for Tony Soprano. Frank Nitti famously went to a shrink and was head shrunk. This is back in the '30s and '40s. Did the show actually deal with that? Do you know of?
Not that I've seen the entire series several years ago. We
Yeah.
watched the last of the original episodes, and they never really dealt with that. On the contrary, they tended to portray Nitti as a man who was very sure of himself, and who often gave off this sense of exasperation that he was sharing with the viewer, almost as if he were turning to the viewer, breaking the fourth wall, and saying to them, "Do you see what I have to deal with on an everyday basis? The kind of men I have working for me, the kind of situations they put me into. Do you see what I have to put up with?"
Yeah.
It's part of what made Nitti such an appealing character, that and the idea that he was always getting the best lines. But no, to be short on the answer, they didn't get into that part of Nitty's life at all. They actually killed Nitty off in an early episode of I think maybe the end of the first season of The Untouchables, and then they brought him back with no attempt to explain his resuscitation, other than that you were to assume that since the show wasn't particularly going in any kind of a chronological order, all of the stories that we see Nitty involved in the future actually took place prior to the one in which he was killed. And they didn't get that part historically accurate either about how he died, but who cared?
Yeah. So the show that I wanted to talk about first, and I'll go the 3 late 60s shows chronologically, was The Green Hornet. Now, The Green Hornet, I think, came from a series of detective novels, dime novels in the 20s or 30s. Famously, the show was spun off of the Batman show, so it had a bit of that wax stuff. It had Bruce Lee as Kato. And the only other detective show that I can think of, even remotely in this, well, 2, is the what's his name, Leslie Nielsen's show in the 80s. What was the name of it? What the Naked Gun came from.
Oh, yeah, Police Squad.
Police Squad, that, yep. And then later, a couple of years later, Sledgehammer. It seems to me that comedy is generally not a good format for a detective show. Why did they? Do you know why they went the Batman route? It was simply because it spun off from Batman that they went that route with Green Hornet.
I think so. I think one of the problems that Green Hornet had was that it could never really decide what it was. It had some of the vibe of Batman. You had colorful sets. You had a superhero who didn't have any superpowers, but he had lived a dual life as a newspaper executive and as the Green Hornet, a crime fighter. Only a limited number of people knew his actual identity. I think that it tried to emulate Batman in that sense, but what it did not do, and this is why it falls into this kind of amorphous category, it did not have a really broad, colorful, outrageous set of villains. It was they were, for the most part, run-of-the-mill. You didn't have the eccentricities. You didn't have the outrageous names. You didn't have the guest stars bringing their own cachet to it. It was a fairly down-to-earth type of series in that sense. And so people who tuned in because they wanted to see a crime-fighting show, maybe a little closer to what the radio version had been, people who wanted to see that thought it was too cartoonish. People who wanted to see something purely in the vein of Batman thought it was too dull, too down-to-earth, too realistic. And you had in the lead Van Williams, who had been in 2 of the Warner Brothers detective series. You'd seen him in Bourbon Street Beat as a young man aspiring to be a detective, and then you saw him playing the same character in Surfside 6, where he now was a private detective and an attorney as well. He had been studying for the bar in Bourbon Street Beat, so they actually did a pretty good job of bringing his character over. But the point about Van Williams, I think, is that he's a fine actor, and he played the Green Hornet very well, but he wasn't campy like Adam West was. And that, I guess, campy is really the word for it. The Green Hornet was not a campy series, and it didn't have enough of Kato in it. You didn't have Bruce Lee dominating the series the way he could have. Because, in fact, if you had let him loose in any of these shows, they would have only been a 5 or 10 minute at most. He would have finished all of the bad guys off fairly quickly. One of the great examples of that was when they had the joint appearance of the Green Hornet and Batman in one episode, and Kato and Robin the Boy Wonder fight to a draw. Nobody's going to believe that Bruce Wayne or that Kato wouldn't have taken care of Robin in about 45 seconds. So that I think ultimately that was the problem. If they had gone with an over-the-top version of the Green Hornet, and if they had had an actor who would have been more suited to that kind of a series, I think it might have had a longer lifespan. As it is, though, I admit to a fondness for it because I have the series. I enjoy it a lot. It's a fun show to watch, but I think you can understand why it didn't have a longer shelf life.
So the second show then I want to speak of in this run of three is Hawaii Five-0, because Hawaii Five-0, had been Hawaiian Eye, I believe it was called, a few years before.
Yes.
But as I recall, that was pretty much sort of like a standard show, whereas Hawaii Five-0 built this fictional universe of 5-0 as state police in Hawaii. You had not only drug dealers and murderers being solved and whatnot, the typical police stuff, but it also had the espionage thing that they could bring in because it's set in the middle of the Pacific. They're dealing with sometimes the Yakuza, with Chinese agents, Soviet agents here and there.
Pearl Harbor there.
And you get this sort of dynamic mix. Plus, you get the fact that it's the first show that has some of its bedrock characters being non-white. Yes, there was some cringe episodes in the first season or two where they had Yellowface, but at least the characters were dealt with as human beings. So what place or input do you put on Hawaii Five-0 within the police procedural?
Well, you're right as to the difference between Hawaiian Eye and Hawaii Five-0, because Hawaiian Eye was part of that Warner Brothers run. It was actually their second most successful detective series after Sunset Strip. But what I think where 5-0 comes in is not only in the creation of this successful fictional universe in which 5-0 operates, because in reality there is no state police force in Hawaii, but they successfully created one and gave it very plausible duties. And what I've always felt was most interesting about 5-0 was that, as you mentioned, they do have a variety of cases going all the way from simple murders and kidnappings to national security issues, because not only of its location, not only because of the background of Pearl Harbor being there, but because Steve McGarrett, Jack Lord's character, was part of the Naval Reserve still, and he was always subject to active duty, and occasionally he was brought in on cases where he was working them not from the aspect of 5-0, but from the aspect of naval intelligence. So it gave him a lot of opportunity to be involved in a lot of different things. What I find most interesting about 5-0 is the McGarrett character himself, because he's a little different from all the other characters we have seen. He is, I would contend that McGarrett is closer to being like Batman and the Green Hornet than he is to Joe Friday or any of the other characters that you've seen in traditional police procedurals. He is, I think, really an icon of what a police detective is really like. He's an iconic character, and I say this not simply in the use of the word of an icon being somebody who is heroic, but he is a symbol of what the police stand for. And therefore, McGarrett gets involved in a lot of situations that are frankly absurd. He gets blinded in one episode. There's another episode where he's in a prison negotiating a hostage situation. There's one of my favorite examples where he is chasing down a criminal on a pier, and the perp grabs a gasoline hose from the pump at the pier and shoots gas all over McGarrett in his face, and McGarrett stops to wipe his eyes clear and keeps right on going, even though he's totally saturated with gas. And at some point you have to figure that what happened was they decided, we're not going to portray McGarrett as an individual, as a real living, breathing character. We're going to portray him as the optimum police official, the Example, he's going to be, no matter what happens to him, he's going to be all right. No matter what crime he may be framed with by the bad guys, he's going to come out of it. Now, if you can break his leg and he'll get out of bed to solve the crime. You can blind him and he'll learn how to get around there. Nothing stopped the man, and you can watch it and say this is ridiculous, or you can embrace it and say this is what they meant to do with the character. They didn't want him to be realistic. They wanted him to be an iconographic representation of the police. And when you watch it in that way, it not only makes sense, it becomes a completely compelling drama of how the police crack down and catch somebody.
It's funny, as you were saying that, I was thinking that it's well known, I think, that Jack Lord was the first person considered to play Captain Kirk in Star Trek before
Yes.
William Shatner. He wanted, like, I think 50% of the show's profits or something, and they said, no way. But Steve McGarrett, to me, is what James Tiberius Kirk would have been in the 20th century had he been.
I would agree.
They're very similar characters, I think, with the one exception is that we don't see McGarrett always macking on every beautiful woman who comes onto in an episode. But other than that, they are the ultimate alpha males.
Yeah. McGarrett is a throwback to the traditional police figure in the sense that he has no private life, and the only time you ever get to see his home is if he's getting a phone call there to come downtown. But there's something about McGarrett that I think every once in a while he will make a statement to a crime lord or a boss who's trying to move in and establish his branch of the syndicate in Hawaii, and McGarrett will say, "Not on my island."
Yeah.
He takes a personal ownership in this, and he takes a personal affront to crime. Crime not only breaks the law, it offends him. And in breaking the law, you're attacking Steve McGarrett. And, boy, that's not a good thing to do. You don't know who you're dealing with. So he's a wonderful character, though.
Yeah, and the thing is, he personalized things that really weren't personal. Most famously, probably his greatest antagonist, and the one that the series ended on, was Woe Fat.
Woe Fat, yep.
Woe to Woe Fat is one of the great television titles for an episode. But the thing with McGarrett is, Woe Fat was like, McGarrett, I respect you and whatnot, but I'm just a businessman kind of thing, doing my thing. But to McGarrett, it was a personal assault on
Yes.
his integrity, and that's what made it so dynamic. Was that you wonder about the McGarrett character? Did he come? Did he not get enough attention from his mother or something? Because everything. I mean, he's moral, but he's indignantly moral. But unlike a lot of figures in American history that play the morale, he really was. Well, we don't see him, molesting children on the side. We don't see him taking bribes from. I mean, this was a guy who lived the ideal that he was portraying.
Yeah, the only character I can think of who's totally comparable to this. I mean, Joe Friday was incorruptible, but you didn't, except for when he was lecturing crooks or crooked cops, it didn't come across that way. The character he's most similar to, I think, is Elliot Ness. And if you want to talk about incorruptible, nobody's more incorruptible than Steve McGarrett. The man has an absolute right and wrong, and I think there may be a handful of episodes where he's willing to bend that a little bit, but you got to be damn sure that if he's doing something like that there are no ramifications of it, and that in fact it's probably furthering the cause of justice that he does it. But this guy is so straight and narrow that I think you could take a T-square and the T-square would come off being crooked next to him. But again, it to me at least, and I think to you as well, it doesn't make him cartoonish. It doesn't make him dislikable. It doesn't make him somebody that antagonizes you. You come away with a kind of admiration for him, that you do hold him up as that ideal, that icon, and you say, this is what a policeman is supposed to be like, setting aside that personal ownership part of it, the idea that this is law and order. This is what we're supposed to represent, and this is who I am.
Yeah. It's sort of like he's one of the good Terminators from the Terminator series. Is that he's like the silver guy played by Robert Patrick. He's just going to keep coming and
Yep.
coming and coming. The commercial break will come, and McGarrett looks like he's beaten. End of commercial. McGarrett's coming and coming and coming.
You get the idea that he's even hunting the guy down during the commercials.
Yeah. So the third show that I want to mention, and then we'll take a break and come back for the '70s. And you mentioned a show called the M Squad, and it immediately brought to mind the Mod Squad. And I'm wondering, was the title the Mod Squad a play off this earlier show, the M Squad?
I don't think so, although I couldn't prove it. But I think the idea of M Squad, and of course the series that parodied M Squad was Police Squad. That's where they got the name. And in fact, if you watch the first episode of M Squad and the first episode of Police Squad, they're almost carbon copies of each other, except Police Squad plays it for laughs. But M Squad was a special branch of the Chicago Police Department that was called in. It had no specific beat. It was called in to investigate particular cases where the precinct involved might need additional help. So it was kind of like a CID type of arrangement. And Lee Marvin was somebody said Lee Marvin was really Jack Webb without the contempt for the civilian that Joe Friday's character could sometimes show. Marvin had total contempt for the criminal, but he didn't display that particular kind of an attitude. If we were talking about religion, we talk about it as being clericalism, but in the sense of the policeman looking down on the people that he is entrusted to, or that are entrusted to him, Marvin didn't display that. His was all reserved for the criminal.
Yeah, so Mod Squad's import is that it had the first female detective, and I believe they were a unit of the LAPD where they were going undercover, and Clarence Williams III was basically the first black sort of super detective, and it ran 3-4 seasons perhaps, but
Yeah.
I remember the dynamic opening and them running in the dark alley, and it seemed it was obviously reaching out to the hippie generation. The very term mod going back to the mods of Great Britain in the mid '60s. Yep. And whatnot. What do you think was the historical import of the Mod Squad? And it seemed to, though, not really. It wasn't the first wave of a vanguard. It historically seems to have just been a very typical piece of that era, but it didn't have any heirs.
You're right. It was part of a wave of television shows that you were seeing in the late 60s and into the 70s, where the networks were trying to readjust their demographics, and they were looking at trying to attract a younger audience, but they were also looking at trying to introduce more relevance into their stories. So you saw a lot of legal dramas like the Storefront Lawyers, the Young Lawyers, different shows about young activists, or showing crimes that had not been shown on television before. Judd for the Defense is a perfect example of a legal drama that falls into that category, where you're showing the challenge of traditional occupations, let's say, whether it's law or law enforcement, where they're meeting a new generation and a new type of criminal and a new type of crime. And the Mod Squad, I think, is most notable as being an attempt to try to show a different aspect of the police. They were known as pigs by then, although that nickname goes back much further. But they were, they were viewed with great suspicion in society at that point in time by a large segment. And so what you were trying to do was humanize them to a certain extent, to act as a sort of way of making them more appealing to a younger generation. I think when you look at a show we haven't mentioned, I'll just mention it briefly, Adam 12. When you look at Kent McCord's character, that was a very similar thing. They introduced Kent McCord to try to give a more positive viewpoint of the police to young people by showing a young, dedicated policeman. And in fact, McCord talks at great length in his personal life about how Adam 12 influenced his own attitude toward the police. And so I think that's what Mod Squad excelled at, was the idea that, yes, you did have a new generation of law enforcement people who are coming in, people who perhaps had more of an understanding of the criminal of the 60s and 70s than the old guard would have. They understand the environment, they understand the pressures they're under, they understand the drug crimes, civil disobedience, anti-war protesters, crimes that perhaps the police force was ill-suited to understand. That's where they came into play, as putting a human face on the new breed, not to coin a phrase from another series, the new breed of police enforcement of the era.
Let us move now on to the 1970s, and it seems that 1970s was when, I guess, all the rules of the previous 25 years was sort of tossed around, because it seemed to me you had shows that we were just mentioning, the Mod Squad, but you had shows where you were getting things put in context, and whereas prior iterations of police shows or even private detectives were, all American, we got to see sort of darker sides of people, and so forth. So let's talk about some of the shows, and let's talk. Well, if I think of the 1970s and I think of detectives, it seems the police and the detective genre sort of blended in some instances. For example, Columbo was a police detective on a force. Starsky and Hutch, similarly, were like the Mod Squad. They were, I believe, undercover agents. I forget for what city.
Yeah, they were almost superhero characters, actually.
Yeah. Then you had Kojak. He was sort of a hypercharged version of Columbo, whereas Columbo was sometimes played for laughs. Telly Savalas was not really. You had then a guy like William Conrad, who we've mentioned before, who had Cannon. Later on, he had Jake and the Fat Man a decade or so later. You had a show like Beretta, in which I believe, wasn't Beretta kicked off the force and became a private eye or something like that?
No, it was actually a spin-off. Well, a spin-off. It was a reconfiguring of Toma.
Okay, yeah, and that I remember Toma, and then you had, again, you had more silly ones like Charlie's Angels, and then you had the sort of humanist exploration of the Rockford Files. So pick up on any of those series where you want to start.
I think that you're right that one of the things that I find striking, we can look at a show like Kojak, because Kojak has kind of Telly Savalas as the celebrity detective, well known to the press, certain to get a lot of publicity in any case that he's working on, and he has a tremendous personal charisma and dynamism that carries him through a very successful run on the series. What I like about Kojak is that we've seen New York as a character in these shows, and we had the last great days of New York in Naked City, where you had New York as kind of the aging debutante. Then you had a series we didn't mention called NYPD that ran for a couple of years, but that was showing New York in decay. And now by the time we get to Kojak in the mid-70s, you have Hell's Kitchen and Times Square, and you have New York in full free fall. So it's kind of like bringing back a beloved character, and you're seeing the character age and degrade and lose some of its mental acuity. And that, what I like about Kojak is that it has a very charismatic and perhaps unrealistic lead, but it's showing a very realistic aspect of what America was like, what urban decay was like, whether it is realistic to people who actually lived in those areas or in those times. It certainly was typical of what people would expect of urban New York, and I think it's introducing that element is one of the things that it is primarily going to be known for when we look at its place in the pantheon, so to speak, of detective shows. Then you have a show like Police Story, which is again kind of a throwback because it's an anthology. So you don't have any regular characters, although you do have some characters who are recurring, who appear on the show more than once. But Police Story takes a different look at policemen. It looks at the pressures that they have in their personal lives as well as trying to solve crimes. Oftentimes, the story in Police Story isn't really about a crime at all. It's about the men who work there, the men and women, and you see what they're subjected to, whether it's in terms of family life pressures or the pressures that they undergo in having to deal with a criminal class that they see getting off in prison, making 10 or 100 times the amount of money that the cops make. So you wonder, how do you continue your motivation in that respect? How do you get into the mean streets of big cities without becoming a criminal yourself? It looked at the police investigator from a more earthy standpoint, from this very human perspective. And it did ask, I think, some real existential questions about the role of law enforcement in modern society, how we regarded them and how they regarded us and their jobs. So I think, and they were almost always literate shows. You can say that Police Story was an influence on Hill Street Blues when we come along to that, because they're showing the same kind of aspects. Hill Street's got a regular cast, but they're still showing the mean streets. Then on the other side, you've got a show like Policewoman, which is when we talk about the female detective. The first show to feature a female police woman was actually a show called Decoy with Beverly Garland in the late 1950s, but that wasn't the same as what we were talking about with the Mod Squad being the first to have that kind of a police detective. Decoy was much more about going undercover as a police woman, more classical types of cases that women would be involved in. In Policewoman, you're seeing an environment that is a little different than that, although I never cease to be amazed looking through old TV guides to find out the number of times that Angie Dickinson was playing a undercover prostitute or an undercover stripper or something like that. I'll give them credit for this. They've got this beautiful woman starring in the show. They are not going to miss an opportunity to take advantage of that. But
Well, I mean, you can't blame him. Charlie's Angels a few years later, how many times was
exactly.
Cheryl Ladd and Jacqueline Smith and Farrah Fawcett in bikinis,
Yeah, exactly. And, they're not all like that, folks. But I think Policewoman has its purpose as well, though, which is that it looks at the glamour of Los Angeles as opposed to the grime of New York. So you're seeing a different aspect of the city again that is serving as a backdrop to the series. I don't consider Policewoman to be gritty crime drama, but it is entertaining and it has an attractive cast, not just physically attractive, but someone like Earl Holliman, who really did very well in a role like that. It's not easy to be playing a second banana to Angie Dickinson and have people remember who you are, but Earl Holliman did a good job in that, and it was a decent entertaining and popular show. So you had shows that were similar to that. And then you had probably the peak of the police comedy series, which is Barney Miller.
Oh, yeah.
And Barney Miller was long seen as the most realistic police show on television, even though it was a sitcom, because it identified with the mundane aspects of police work in a way you would never get from watching a show like Starsky and Hutch, where it's, Starsky and Hutch is sort of like Batman on steroids without costumes, with a little bit of detective work thrown in, because these guys pushed the envelope wherever they could. Barney Miller is a lot more like what the job of a policeman really is. It has its ups and its downs. It has times when you're going to be threatened and shot at, and times where you are so bored that you can sit there and write a book when you're not doing reports. And it had a dynamic cast with marvelous chemistry, terrific leads, nice people that you feel like you would like if you met them in real life. And the comedy was not over the top. It was sometimes exaggerated to make a point, but it was very gentle humor. And it mixed in its social commentary as well, but in the best way. Unlike a show that David Susskind would do, an NYPD type of show. It made its point about social commentary, but it did it in a much gentler way, without preaching and with humor. And that's why I think so many people loved Barney Miller, and why it stands alone. It's not like Police Squad, a spoof. It's not like Car 54, which is really, Sergeant Bilko on the police force. That kind of broad humor. It's a show among itself, not only in police stories, but in comedy as well. And
well, you got the realism of a cop's daily thing. He's not going to be dealing with a serial killer every week. He's going to be dealing with grandma hitting grandpa over the head with an umbrella because grandpa whistled at a pretty girl or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're going to be getting people who are mentally disturbed. You're going to be getting people who aren't mentally disturbed, but people think they are. I can't really imagine what would happen in Dragnet if Friday and Gannon, by this time, if they had encountered a man who was accusing the biggest figures in the city of being members of the Trilateral Commission.
Yeah.
I don't know how they would have handled that. In Barney Miller, they handled it wonderfully.
I mentioned a number of shows, but the one show that I did want to also talk a little bit about is Charlie's Angels, because to me it's really the first fantasy cop or detective show, because if you think of the setup, it's sort of like Fantasy Island but with beautiful women solving crimes, because Charlie is this super rich dude who no one knows or has seen, or except maybe David Doyle's character.
Yeah.
But we, the audience, never see him. We only hear the voice of John Forsythe. They are sent, around the world. They're globetrotting, and it's three women who apparently didn't do that well on the LAPD test to become cops. Well, I think maybe Sabrina, played by Kate Jackson, was the smartest one. Maybe she made it, and it's like, where did they even come up with this idea? Because how are you going to have, police women who are I think one of them was a meter maid, suddenly going against people that would give Steve McGarrett a hard time?
Yep. You really check your belief at the door when you turn on Charlie's Angels. My friend David Hofstad's written about Charlie's Angels before. He's very fond of the show and the people in it. And I think that you have to separate it from its entertainment value and its value as a type of police show. You really do have to check it at the door, because I don't know that there's nothing plausible about the setup. Having said that, some of the storylines can be quite compelling, but there's nothing plausible that would compare to what we've seen on other shows of its type. And I think that if you take it as a fantasy, and I think you put it very well when you were talking about the genre of police fantasy. It really is in a class by itself, and it deserves to be, because even when they made the movies, even when they tried to reboot the series, nothing can compare to the original in terms of its effectiveness, in terms of the cast, and in terms of their ability to be able to sell a concept like this and at least make people watch it on a weekly basis. An incredibly popular show. And if all you're going to do is, like me, sit around and look at it in terms of the plausibility factor, you're going to miss the purpose of it as just pure fun entertainment and a chance to look at some truly attractive women doing, who are at least played as human beings and not just as dumb dolls who always need a man to come forward and bail them out every week.
Yeah, it occurs to me also as we were just mentioning it. Aside from Charlie being sort of the Mr. Rourke of detectives, when I think of shows that have been parodied in film decades later, I think of the Brady Bunch.
Hmm.
Those films might have a few tee moments here or there, but they're never as funny when you watch the original. When you watch the original Brady Bunch and Marcia gets hit in the face with a football and oh my nose and uh, trying to and making a whole mini little drama in this comedy about that. It's never going to be as funny when you're parodying something that
No.
at its core is parody or absurdist and trying to make Charlie's Angels seem absurd by bringing it 30 years in the future or whatever it was, like you said, it misses the point because it's based on an absurd premise, and to try to parody it is kind of ridiculous.
No, it's like trying to riff a comedy on Mystery Science Theater. When you're doing
Yeah.
a movie that's so bad it's funny, that's one thing. But to parody a movie that is already making fun of itself is almost impossible.
Yeah.
To skip into the 80s just for the purposes of this discussion, if you want to see what you really do with an alternate version of female crime fighters, you go to a show like Cagney and Lacey,
Yeah.
because that bears no resemblance whatever to Charlie's Angels, except you've got women in the lead role. But you can't top Charlie's Angels, and you can't parody it. So if you want to make another series about female police detectives, you don't try to do a ripoff of Angie Dickinson, and you don't try to do a parody of a policewoman. You go in a different direction entirely, and that's why I think you see Cagney and Lacey being more influential, in the sense that you come to see other female police officials or detectives in the future who are modeled on them, and you see the social commentary modeled on that, rather than seeing it on these other shows. If you're gonna do a female police show and make it plausible, that's the one you got to model for the future.
Before we just hit the 80s in general, I just wanted to ask you, did you have any concept about a show like The Streets of San Francisco?
Streets of San Francisco, I think, is very much a formulaic, run-of-the-mill show.
Yeah.
Now, it's good. I don't put it down to say that. It's a Quinn Martin production, so you already know it's going to have great location shooting. It's going to have a strong guest star cast, pretty good writing, and pretty good acting. And you've got a pair of actors. You've got Carl Malden and Michael Douglas, who have great chemistry on the show and who understand how to work together as the old cop, new cop type of a dynamic. There is nothing special or extraordinary about it. It's just, I think, a good show.
So the 1980s, it seems to me, Reaganism is always compared to the 1950s. And the odd thing, it seems to me, we get this dichotomy again between cop shows and detective shows. The cop shows become more gritty, more realistic. The Hill Streets, the Cagney and Lacey's, the NYPD Blues, and then onward through the CSI and NCIS and all these shows that have acronyms. On the other hand, the detective shows seem to go back to a more simpler bumpkin kind of way. Magnum PI is a good show, but
Yes.
it certainly I mean, in a sense, he becomes the male fantasy of a single Charlie's Angel who's
Yeah.
male. But then
Good point.
you get the Matlocks, and you get the Jessica Fletchers, and you get Vegas with Robert Urich, and you get the Lee Horsley knockoff of Magnum PI, and it's just odd that the police shows seem to be getting more realistic, more focused on the gritty, whereas the detective shows are going back to this sort of homespun Miss Marple kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I've got a theory on that for
Go
what
ahead.
it's worth, and I always preface this by saying my theories are worth what you pay to hear them. But my theory is that as the police procedural got grittier, got grimier, and you started to introduce the concept of anti-heroes, and you started to see the concept of the police having to break the law in order to enforce the law, you were eliminating a big aspect of what made the detective series popular in the first place, which was the private detective's ability to operate outside the law. Once you've got the police engaging in suspect kinds of actions, or when you've got it being as gritty as these newer shows are, you really are going over into the territory of what the private eye used to be about. Again, when we're talking about the rougher, grittier, more violent private eyes, so the result is that when you get some of the shows that you've mentioned, what you're going back is to almost to the era of the jazz detective that we talked about earlier, where you're emphasizing style and you're emphasizing their rapport with the police and their personality, their personal lives, and the whether you're talking about the quirkiness of their clients or the kinds of cases they're getting into, they're no longer seen as the kind of character who's got to go out there and break heads, or that has to go out into the back streets that the police don't go into, because that has now become the entire basis of what the police genre has become in the first place. So that's my theory, is that they had to find a different a different playground to play on, because their space was being taken up by shows like Miami Vice or Hill Street Blues or NYPD Blue.
Yeah, and
Or Law and Order. I think Law and Order SVU, for example, is a great example of that.
Probably for me the worst example of the kind of silliness of the individual who goes to be a detective. And I love Jack Klugman from The Odd Couple, but Quincy M.E. was always, to me, such a ridiculous show. I mean, there are so many legal problems with a medical examiner going beyond and above and beyond his or her job that in real life Quincy would have been fired after the second episode.
Quincy was one of those shows that when I started watching it, it was because it was on people who read my website, who've read me writing about my youth watching TV, will know what I'm talking about. That I grew up in a place called the world's worst town, where we only had one TV station, and it was NBC. And so for a formative part of my life, when I was in high school,
it could have been Univision, and then you wouldn't have even known the language.
Well, the relevance being that Quincy was one of those shows that I watched because I didn't have any choice. And when we moved back into the Twin Cities and were exposed to all the stations again, Quincy was the type of a show I couldn't continue to watch for that reason. He not only was was involved in crimes in a totally inappropriate way, but he was a crusader. He was loud. He was using it as a soapbox, which
Yeah.
is entirely what you're not supposed to do. And when you contrast it with what we see in the more scientific forms of investigation, shows like CSI, where you get a look at the forensic aspects of law enforcement, you understand that you always let the evidence dictate where you're going, and not the personalities,
Yeah.
not some of the other things that are going. The science, for someone involved in that kind of work, the science has to be what dictates things, and it's the perfect. If you can't watch Quincy, but you like to watch police science. Yeah, I'd even recommend Heck Ramsey as an alternative to Quincy, because Heck Ramsey introduces the idea of a time when people are just starting to learn about at the turn of the centuries, from the 18 to the 1900s, when they're learning about things like fingerprints. But CSI shows you how it ought to be done, as opposed to Quincy showing you, it's probably what medical examiners throughout the country used to fantasize about. They would get up writing in fever dreams, writing scripts about themselves solving crimes. Super coroner.
Yeah, I mean, you can
I
have that.
can't take it.
Yeah, you can have that fantasy with a Jessica Fletcher as a mystery writer,
Hmm.
because it's absurd that a 70-year-old woman who writes her Miss Marple like stories is going to do it. But then again, it's sort of a meta thing, because it's sort of commenting on the Miss Marple kind of thing.
Yep.
But when you have a government official, it's I mean, well, we can throw out a lot of the norms here in the age of Trump. Maybe a Quincy could get away with it, and now, but like I said, it was absurd. But now we're getting to the 90s and so on, and as this is where I get limited. I have to rely on you a bit more. So where did these two branches go in the last 30 years? Where did who are the successors to Ben Matlock and Jessica Fletcher, and who are the successors to the alphabet, NCIS, ABC, the
Yeah.
KYB, or whatever?
Well, I think, from the police side, the successors in these shows became the gritty crime drama. There are two classifications. I think you've got the gritty crime drama, like Homicide, or Law and Order, the original, or NYPD Blue, shows that you would have thought of once upon a time as being what you'd call cable shows, because they were dealing not only, in the case of NYPD Blue, with limited amounts of nudity, but you were dealing with a very rough set of customers and circumstances that forced you to confront the idea of law enforcement people being as rough almost as the people they were investigating. And when I was talking about it being hard to tell the two apart, a show like Homicide, I think, brings that aspect out brilliantly, where you see how the lines blur, and how a thoughtful man could really question what the purpose of being a law enforcement official was, when there was so little difference, it seemed, between the cops and the crooks. So you had that kind of gritty realism. Then you had a show, like Hunter, or Walker, Texas Ranger, which are much more like the policeman as superhero,
Yeah.
where you're getting suspects blown away at an appalling rate, particularly when you consider that even when these shows were made, most policemen had to go on administrative leave if they were involved in any kind of a gun-related situation, even if they didn't kill the suspect. And certainly if they did kill the suspect, they'd be on admin leave pending an investigation, even if it was a righteous killing. And how most policemen, and I'm not using that word in a gender-affirming way, by the way, I just easier to say because of so many of the shows we're talking about really focus on policemen. But the police officers, most of them never use their guns. very few use it. Nobody uses it to the extent that T.J. Hooker
Yeah.
or Hunter use them. And they're not complex shows. They're very black and white. Um, they seldom show the kind of actual intrinsic struggle that a policeman has when he has to use his gun. And when he realizes he's maybe shot a 17-year-old kid who has no life ahead of him, and you question yourself, and those are shows that don't even try to go there, and they're really all for entertainment. And the black and white, good guy, bad guy, they're a throwback to the westerns and to the early police shows that we've seen.
And
Then
the,
I think there's
the Fall Guy is another show similar to that.
yes, I think you're right. There are all kinds of examples of shows like that take so many liberties with realism that you only watch them for their entertainment value. And I would never criticize anybody who loved a show like Hunter or The Rookie or any of these other shows that put that deal with something, maybe not The Rookie, but that deal with something like that, because they are very entertaining. But that brings us to the third kind of police drama that we've talked. I think you've got the gritty realism, you've got the superhero fantasy, and then you've got the one that's more interested in Freudian psychology, where you're looking not only at the psychology of the criminals, which is what we used to see in the great shows like Naked City or the FBI, you're looking at the psychology of the police as well, and not in a way that you did in Police Story, where they're struggling with the pressures of the job, but you're looking at people who have soap opera-like backgrounds and live soap opera-like lives. You see detectives who are living in homes, in apartments or lofts or condos that not that many years previously you would have had to have been on the take to afford. And you're living in a place like that would have automatically raised all kinds of suspicions. You go back to the shows of the 50s and 60s, most policemen, if they weren't married, lived in studio apartments. They didn't live in lofts. And so you've got and almost all of these detectives have some kind of a backstory where they're either revenging a parent who was brutally raped and murdered, or a relative or something that happened to them that I'm almost positive would disqualify them in the psychological examination they'd have to undergo to get into the academy. And so what they're doing is they're trying to use it as an excuse for a Freudian psychoanalysis of the characters. And I think that they become preposterous because it bleeds over into the way they investigate their crimes. They bring baggage with them that they probably would not be allowed to bring if they were investigating a real crime, and they react in ways that would be totally inappropriate, not only in the way they gather their evidence, but in the way they deal with the suspects. That, I think, we did a show on this a long time ago just about this aspect of these shows. It drives me crazy because there's no regard for civil liberties. There's no regard for any kind of treating the public as your employer. One of the things that I loved about Naked City was that there was always this understanding from the boss on down, from Horace McMahon's character on down to the detectives that worked under him, that you were a public servant. And whenever people would come to complain about something, if they were worried about something that might seem trivial to them, they would always take the same attitude that doctors used to take. It's better to be safe than sorry. And they would say, you can never waste our time. We're here to serve you. And in these modern shows, the police wind up looking more like any civilian that comes into the department is an imposition on them. You expect us to solve crimes for you? How dare you? And they
don't most police precincts or most police in cities say that we serve, or the word serve is
to protect and to serve.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of mentality of the servant leader, if you want to coin one of these business phrases I hate, but this idea of the servant leader is what police work to a great extent is supposed to be about. And I understand. I take nothing away from real life police, law enforcement people, because they've got a miserable job and everybody hates them. You can't do anything right. And I understand all of that, but I don't think that they're done any favors by the way they're portrayed in modern shows, because you either have this total disregard for civil liberties, or you have this fantasy world where the only people that they ever go after are bad guys, and you can afford to say if you're not guilty you have nothing to hide, which is preposterous.
Yeah.
Or you have these action adventure shows that bear no resemblance to even regular non-police life. So that I think is where the three avenues of police procedurals that we have nowadays.
So I wanted to bring up a show that I've only seen 2 or 3 episodes of, and here in the Austin, Texas area, it airs on something like Channel 42.7. You know, everything now is some. It's never Channel 12 or something. Yeah. And it's one of those shows that has only cop shows that that serves one of these little mini networks. And we've talked about the difference between episodic television and why everything now is serial. And both of us wish for more episodic, not totally,
Yes.
but go back a little bit. So famously, I think it was on NYPD Blue in the mid to late 80s when that came on. We saw David Caruso's Bare Ass. And then we saw that show took what Hill Street started, Hill Street Blues, and the cop shows became. I guess Law and Order doesn't do it. Maybe they do. I don't know. But a lot of these shows became more like soap operas. And the end of that, 30 years later, when whatever, seems to me, I saw this show called Blue Bloods with the guy who played Magnum,
Tom Selleck. Yeah.
And I have to say, this was a really bad, and I saw maybe 3 full episodes and a handful of stuff. It's utter and total propaganda. It's set in Boston or New York. I think it's in New York. It's everything that made Magnum a great show, a great sort of feel good escapist show, and it's a suffocating show. It's a show that if you don't agree with the show's point of view that these cops are demigods in a sense, because it's a lineage of family that Selleck is the head of, and they show these things that are these little parts from their life, and then they come back and they'll show, oh, we're going to be taking on this mobster, or these Chinese triads, or whatever it might be, the threat. And it seems to me that this is the end product of the serial mindset, is that we have to know all of this stuff. We have to know every little angst, and what we get then is we get these solemn shots looking up at Tom Selleck as if he's Zeus on the throne talking down to his children. And I don't know if you've ever seen the show, but I just think it's so grittingly bad.
I've not seen it, but I've read enough about it that what you're describing sounds very familiar to me from the impressions I have of it myself. And again, I have one of those free theories about this, that when you look at an actor like Selleck, whom I'm sure doesn't come cheap, or any of these other actors that you see who become huge stars on television and who command big salaries, but who in return can sell that series and get it on the schedule for you. My theory is that one of the reasons you see so many soap opera elements and serialized elements is because in the old days, a lot of these functions were served by the guest star. So again, if you were going to get into a complex story where Jack Klugman is on Naked City playing a kidnapper, you understand the angst that he feels because he and his wife are unable to have children. And so you understand something about his character. when you are dealing with a regular weekly series that has a huge amount of resource financially committed to its starring cast, you can't afford to have the guest stars be the ones to carry the storyline and to be able to use these backstories and soap opera psychology. You've got to put that onto the main stars themselves because you can't afford to do it otherwise. And so I think, at least in part, that's why you have this kind of a dichotomy. The other reason is because you are selling it as a serial. You're binge watching it. You want people to be able to watch the whole thing at once, and it's much easier to binge watch a serial than it is episodic TV. And you want them to care about the people that they're watching. And somehow, for me, caring about Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. as Louis Erskine on the FBI, what I cared about was that he caught the bad guy, that he upheld the law, and that he didn't get shot himself. I didn't care if he was sleeping around. I didn't care if he came from a broken family. I didn't care if he was undergoing some kind of personal torment or having a problem with his landlord or with his partner or anybody else. And quite frankly, unless you're a close personal friend of mine, I don't care about most people having that kind of a thing. Exceptions, of course, noted, but I think it's the TMI syndrome for me. And we don't need to have that with our heroes. We need to have something where we can kind of look up to them.
Yeah, and even a worse example of that than this Blue Bloods show, which I think probably came from a novel or a detective novel or something. I don't know where it came from. Maybe it was just born out of someone's experience, an ex-cop writing about it. But the worst example, an even worse example than that, and I think an even worse show was, we have all these CSIs and NCIS and JAG and all like I said, these
MOUSE,
all of these acronym shows. But then when they've tried to do reboots, and I think I briefly mentioned this in another show, the reboot of Hawaii Five-0 was atrocious. I think it's 10 years gone now. It ran from 2013 to 15 or something. The only thing that they salvaged from the real show was the opening theme song, and even that was a lesser version. But it seemed to want to do everything wrong that the original show got right, with the exception again of the yellow face. They never went there because 40 or 50 years later you can't do that. But Steve McGarrett, and I'm trying to remember because I only saw again about 3 or 4 episodes. I'm not sure if the Steve McGarrett of the reboot is supposed to be Lords McGarrett, or is he the grandson or something? It might be like Steve McGarrett the third.
I don't know myself, but I've heard both.
But the guy is a Ken doll. I don't even know the actor's name. He's got Barbie doll girl. Everyone is good looking. There's no they had the original Hawaiian guys, and they often were chunky and stocky, and they were burly, and Dano was a rather short guy. He wasn't a big palooka. The only guy who was all American was Steve McGarrett himself.
Exactly.
But as we talked about, but in this one, there was no camera stick. It had that serialized effect, and the fact that it's doing this on what I would consider a landmark show, and doing it so badly, it amazes me that it lasted 3 seasons. I guess on CBS, was it, or did they go to NBC?
I think it was on CBS. Yeah, well, you see these studios that are obsessed with the idea of doing something with their intellectual property, and they decide that it's easier to reboot Magnum or 5-0 or Perry Mason on HBO than it is to think up a new and original idea. And so, I mean, geez. The original Hawaii Five-0 was shown in color. It's not like you're remaking a black and white series. If you want Hawaii Five-0, the whole series was remastered and it's on DVD. Put that on. I share your exasperation with those, and I think it's like the endless number of sequels that you see in the movie theaters, dealing with a property simply for its intellectual property and ignoring its roots. I can't take credit for this line, but the best line I ever read was someone talking about the reboot. I think it was of the Wild Wild West, the movie that they
Yeah.
made of it. It might have been a different one, but their point nonetheless was, why did you do it? Because if you were trying to capitalize on name recognition, the only people who recognize the title are people who watch the original series and are apt to be pissed off by what you're doing to it. For anybody else, it doesn't mean anything else. You could have called it anything. And you know what's wrong? Hawaii Five-0, as you pointed out, was the latest in a long line of shows that took place in Hawaii. There's no reason that you can't have another detective show in Hawaii. There was no reason you couldn't have had a gritty 1930s, 40s series about a struggling detective lawyer and called it something other than Perry Mason, because if you're a fan of Perry Mason like I am, you're going to resent the hell out of the idea that you're taking Hamilton Berger and turning Hamilton Berger into a female and having her have a lesbian relationship with Della Street. And for those of you out there, if you watched the show and if you loved it, and if I got the facts all wrong, vast apologies. I did see something to that effect, and I couldn't read it any further. But that's the point. You're going to make people like me angry. You're not going to attract new people. You're going to find that niche population who likes a new spin on an old favorite, and that is not going to sustain your series. So I don't know why they do it unless they want to keep the intellectual property in-house and make sure nobody else runs off with it and does something else. And I'd have to be a lawyer to know about the contract on that. But otherwise, it's just lazy.
So where do we stand now in 2025 in both of these separate, the cop and the detective dramas? I mean, are we heading back towards these Trump years? Are we going to see a reemergence of the Mike Hammer? Hit him first and ask questions later. Let's break things. Mike Hammer is such a Trumpian character.
He is, I mean, you can say that for better or for worse.
Yeah.
And I think that that what you have to look at is you first of all you've got this increasing trend toward streaming television, serialized television, and very short seasons. So you're talking about maybe a 10 or 12 show arc for an entire season, which means you have more of a likelihood that you're going to have in these shows, you have a story that's going to run through the entire season, and then you have a series of B stories or C stories that will be solved over a smaller arc, or they could either be episode to episode, or they could be more a little more focused than that. But I think you're going to see that kind of a trend. You're going to see a real dichotomy on how police are portrayed. You're either going to see them as the heroes, as you mentioned, the Trumpian Hammer type of hero, or you're going to see them coming under more and more scrutiny, where you're going to see discussions about the Black Lives Matter type of thing, and they're going to be used as a platform to be talking about social discussions. I think that's what I think you're going to see more blended sex series where you have male and female partners, or you have all female leads. I think some of the shows that they have like that, a couple of the newer shows that I've jotted down, you've got a show like East New York, and where you have something like that happening. And so I think that's the future of the police drama. You're going to have these continuing to be set in the urban areas where they're going to be seen as gritty, and where you're going to be dealing with urban types of crimes. So you're going to have some shows, I think, that are set in either the West, as in the sense that Yellowstone was set in the West, but what you're going to have is them as self-aware contrasts to the kind of show that you see otherwise. So it's not just going to be a standard police procedural that happens to be set in a small town. It's going to be saying more like, look at us, we're contrasting ourselves to this. Now, I think that, as far as the police, the option to the police, which is the private detective series, I think you look at a show like Bosch, which was very successful in the streaming. You're going to see more corporate types of detectives rather than the freelance lone wolf private eye type. And I think that you might, as the police are coming under more scrutiny, now that I think about it, I think you may see the private detective reemerge as an alternative to the police, whereas the police are going to be suspect. They're going to be drawing more scrutiny. They're going to be more suspicious. You're going to see the private detective emerge as kind of the old-fashioned character who's either settling a score or has a vendetta or can work outside the law so as to avoid having to have those kinds of dichotomies. And I also think one of the things about a series like Bosch is that it leans on the noir aspect of detective shows. And detective shows without noir are very difficult. They're not impossible, because Magnum is a perfect example of that, but I think they might lean into more period pieces, into more of the noirish elements, without the black and white cinematography, obviously. But I think they're going to try to do something like that. So that's where I see the future going. And there's one thing I want to add at the very end to that influences the way I think about it. I was doing some research on my book a while back, and I came upon this remarkable statistic. Well, at least it's remarkable to me. Your mileage may vary. But in the 1960s, in 1964, and so for perspective, this is just after the assassination of Kennedy. It's just before the Kennedy conspiracies that the government might have been involved in it took off. In 1964, you had roughly 80% of the public saying that they trusted the government all of the time or most of the time to make the right decision. And so I think we can include the police in situations like this, that most of the time in 1964, you were saying that the police are on the right side of the law, that they're doing the best job that they can, that they're being victimized by the courts, but that they have our best interests at heart. By 2015, that number, which had been at 80%, government's going to do the right thing most or all of the time, that figure dropped down to 15%, I think it was. It was between 15 and 20% believed that. So there's this great cynicism toward the government, and that includes the police. Now, in that kind of an environment, when you've got everything from the deep state to just your plain old-fashioned conspiracies to even plainer and more old-fashioned corruption, who better to take on something like that than a lone wolf detective who's got all kinds of technology at hand to be able to go into the dark web and to find all these things out? He might be a lone wolf. He might be like a part of a larger team. I call them corporate when you get something like Suits, but it could also be a group of people, like-minded people, doing this to bring the man down, that kind of thing. I think that's the path of the future for the private detective serial, is to be working outside of the law again, to be doing the things that the police can't do. But whereas in the 60s it was because the police had lines they couldn't cross, now it's because the police aren't trusted to be able to make the right choice, and you've got to have somebody who hasn't sold out. So I think it's a fertile ground. I don't know whether or not they will do it, and if they do it, I don't know whether or not they'll be successful. But they certainly have every opportunity to succeed with it.
So to wrap things up, let me just ask you, and I'll give my answer first. But let me just ask you, if you had to, be on a remote island somewhere and had the DVDs of any particular show, one cop show procedural and
Hmm.
one detective, which would it be? For me, for the cop show, I'll take Hawaii Five O, the original, simply because it I think pushed more boundaries than just about any other show. It was more inclusive, which what they like to say now. Again, even with the sins of the several episodes of Yellowface early on, and if we're talking on the detective side, it's hard. I'm gonna include all these three shows because I think they might occupy the same fictive universe. One is the Rockford Files, which I think
Hmm.
brought maturity and intelligence to the genre, and then it's sort of later, sexier clone, if you will, Magnum PI, which is a show that I didn't watch in its original run. It was about 20 years later, about 20 years ago, when I first saw it when I was unemployed for a few months, and I watched some of the shows, and I was like, boy, this really is. I mean, Tom Selleck. Uh, wasn't really a himbo. He was an interesting, intelligent character. I remember one episode where he's just floating in the water after his boat sinks, and the whole show is set in flashbacks. I'm saying this is a very interesting show, and it again contrasts so much with the terrible character he plays on this Blue Bloods. So which if you had to only
Hmm.
had two DVD series, one for a cop show and one for a detective, which one would you take?
Well, I think, part of it I think depends on how long I think I'm going to be on the island. If I think I'm going to be on the island no more than 2 or 3 years, I would probably choose Naked City. For the quality. If it was going to be longer than that, I'd be inclined to go along with you on 5 just because of the sheer number of episodes that it made. You'd be able to get a much longer entertainment thing, and therefore by the time you got to the end of the series, you'd be ready to watch it again because you would have forgotten some of the episodes. For a private detective type of show, we didn't talk about British shows at all. If we had, my choice would be the Jeremy Brett version of Sherlock Holmes.
Mm.
But if we're just talking about the detective shows, I'm going to go with one that we didn't talk about, which is Harry O. with
Ah,
David Jansen, and it only ran 2 seasons. My preference is the second season because in the second season his cop sparring partner was Anthony Zerbe, and um, David Jansen and Anthony Zerbe had the greatest chemistry in that show. It was it made the show just watching the interaction between the two and how you could speculate on what each man thought of the other in an intelligent way, and how's Trench, which is Zerbe's character. Trench really did like Orwell, and he really was worried about something happening to him, but he would never let Orwell know that. And if you even whispered a word to Orwell that Trench was worried, he'd bust you down to the patrol again. That kind of dynamic was terrific, and the shows were fun too. But even in the first season, before Zerbe comes on, when Harry's sidekick is Henry Darrow, um, those episodes are really good too. There's something more existential about them. Harry's narration is much more like the kind of 40s noir narration where he's talking about life rather than simply the kind of narration that gets you from point A to point B within the plot itself. So I go with Harry O. First season for the overall quality, second season for the dynamics of the relationship.
yeah, it's odd. I hadn't thought of that show for a long time after the Fugitive. Jansen never got another show after Harry O, did he?
I think that was it. I think from then on, what he was mostly doing were TV movies or miniseries. But I think because Harry O was such a bad experience for him in that it was canceled, and in that the network was constantly meddling to try to make it more action oriented rather than character oriented. I think that soured Jansen on any idea of doing a weekly TV again.
Yeah, I remember. I mentioned to you how I remember Buzz Kulik, the director of a western that Jansen starred in '67 or '68. was doing porno films in 1970 as a kid that I went in on, and I remember the big poster of David Jansen that he had signed. To Buzz from David kind of thing. Yeah, David Jansen. It's a shame he never got anything more. But for those who want to hear me and Mitch ramble on, next month we'll be back with some topic of interest, hopefully.
Something exciting, yes.